LiberalViewer presents.
So back in January, one of my more misguided colleagues on the Polypop network, Lee Doren, uploaded a video titled Voter ID to his How the World Works channel that was full of right-wing talking points but failed to address two important facts about requiring government-issued photo IDs to vote that I pointed out in his comment section. First, there's no credible evidence that in-person voter impersonation fraud, the only fraud that voter ID prevents, is even a minor problem, and second, 11% of U.S. citizens, more than 21 million Americans, don't have government-issued photo ID, including 25% of African American citizens of voting age and 18% of Americans over the age of 65. Now, Lee tried to support his position for a while in his comment section, citing a book by right-wing columnist John Fund that didn't end up having any examples of fraud that voter ID would prevent in it, and when the argument moved to Twitter, Lee even tried using a breaking news story from South Carolina about Republican allegations that over 900 dead people voted. But a few weeks later, when the investigation of those dead voter cases found clerical errors but no actual cases of voter fraud, even Lee Doren had to admit I was right that the lack of evidence of any fraud can't justify disenfranchising millions with voter ID laws. So I was somewhat surprised last week to see a supposedly straight news program on Fox use Lee Doren's same specious misinformation months later in a story meant to scare voters with the supposed threat to democracy you can see in this teaser clip.
Just months before Americans go to the polls, a new report shining light on a serious threat to our democracy. We take a much closer look at voter fraud in America.
Now, it's true that there's voter fraud in America of various kinds, but one kind that's almost non-existent is the only kind that requiring a government ID to vote would prevent, and that's in-person voter impersonation fraud, which is rare for a lot of reasons, a main one being that it's not an efficient way to steal elections, because even if one person can fake vote 10 times on election day, to steal even just 1,000 votes would require 100 fake voters, and that's a huge conspiracy when it's so much easier for an election thief to get 1,000 or even 10,000 fake absentee ballots or fake polling place ballots without needing all those live bodies to go around and vote. But the Fox News story never made clear that voter ID is a solution to a non-existent problem, instead saying it's based on a serious concern in the introduction to the story here.
A brand new Fox News report is raising serious concerns about the potential for voter fraud just months before the presidential election. While this issue, of course, is not new, a number of states have recently passed voter ID laws in hopes of preventing fraud. The Department of Justice shot them down, arguing the laws discriminate against minorities.
Now, of course, voter ID stops more people from voting than just minorities, with about 18% of senior citizen voters not having a government ID, like the nuns stopped from voting in Indiana, or Ruth L. Frank, who stopped from voting in Wisconsin. But Fox News forgot to mention those stories despite all the senior citizen Fox News viewers, instead going to supposedly straight news reporter Eric Shawn, who let Republican governor of South Carolina Nikki Haley float that same debunked dead voter story even Lee Doren gave up on that you can see here.
Without photo ID, what do you fear could happen?
Well, without photo ID, I mean, let's be clear, I don't want dead people voting in the state of South Carolina. I've said that from the very beginning.
And authorities say there is evidence that dead people voting is a real problem, according to a statewide investigation by South Carolina's Department of Motor Vehicles. In January, it found that 953 ballots were cast by voters who were deceased, though the State Elections Commission director disputes those findings.
Notice how that report gave almost 20 seconds and a big graphic to the report of the 953 dead voters and gave less than 4 seconds to the so-called dispute of those findings, which was actually an investigation that found many clerical errors but no actual cases of voter fraud. Yet, instead of telling viewers about any of that, the Fox News story instead relied on the debunked report to question criticism of voter ID, while giving the Republican governor almost another 20 seconds to make it sound like she's protecting the vote instead of stopping people from voting in this clip.
The report came out after Haley signed the voter ID law, but hasn't stopped the criticism of it.
Were you surprised at the reaction that you got from this?
Very surprised. Protecting the integrity of the voting process is one of the most important things we can do as a governor in a state, and the will of the people was that they wanted to see that integrity protected.
So not only did Fox News there let the Republican governor get away with claiming she was protecting voters when she's actually disenfranchising them using the same bogus report of dead voters that Lee Doren gave up on, but supposedly straight news anchor Gregg Jarrett then brought on that same right-wing columnist Lee Doren tried to use, John Fund, who again talked about voter fraud cases without ever giving evidence of the type of fraud that voter ID would prevent in this clip.
John Fund joins us, senior editor at American Spectator, and has a new book about to come out on voter fraud. It comes out later this summer. John, good to see you.
Thank you.
People who oppose voter ID say, look, voter fraud is a canard. It's a myth. What say you?
Well, I say if you look around the country, you see a lot of close elections that could have been influenced and changed by voter fraud. There are currently election officials in New York and Florida who themselves are accused and been indicted of trying to commit voter fraud. And this is something that people are concerned about. 64% of Americans, Greg, in the latest Rasmussen poll say voter fraud is a serious or somewhat serious problem. In fact, a higher percentage of African Americans think it's a serious problem than whites.
Now, just because African American and other voters have concerns about election fraud doesn't mean that in-person voter impersonation fraud is an actual problem, but maybe the most Orwellian part of that Fox News story was the way it argued through softball questioning to Republican Governor Nikki Haley that it's the Democrats ginning up fears about voter suppression rather than Republicans trying to gin up fears of voter fraud to justify voter suppression, as you can see in this clip.
Governor Haley was asked by our Eric Shawn whether or not, for political purposes, the White House may try to gin up this issue before the election. Here's a clip.
Do you think the administration has been trying to gin this up for political purposes?
And it's just oddly ironic that we have an election coming up. And it's oddly ironic that we're trying to get this passed before that election and that they are stopping us and saying we can't do it.
Now, nothing's oddly ironic about the Justice Department trying to stop voting rules that disenfranchise voters, but the Fox News story never brought on anyone to talk about that disenfranchisement, like the findings of the nonpartisan Brennan Center showing the millions of voters, many of them elderly, many of them minorities, who'll have significant problems voting if a photo ID is required. Instead, supposedly straight news anchor Gregg Jarrett just let the partisan Republican columnist John Fund disparage those nonpartisan findings without any challenge, even chiming in support at the end, as you can see in this clip.
The Department of Justice says, look, this is just a rampant discrimination against minorities. That's what is behind these laws, to try to help Republicans. Any evidence of that?
Well, they're relying on some very suspect studies that claim that 25% of African Americans lack a photo ID. I don't believe that. That's ridiculous. When you actually have court cases look into this, a very small number of people don't lack ID. And since the ID is free in these states that have passed photo ID laws, I say we're doing people a favor by helping them get a voter ID, because you can't travel, you can't cash a check, you can't enter a federal building without a voter ID.
Yeah, you can't do anything these days without some form of identification.
Of course, millions of Americans live their lives without photo identification, and even if the photo ID itself is free, that doesn't mean the documents to get it are free, like a copy of a birth certificate that could be from another state or another country, and a free photo ID doesn't help voters like Ruth L. Frank, who never had a birth certificate at all. But Fox News doesn't care about all those voters who won't be able to vote under voter ID laws. Instead, Fox News is only interested in justifying this wave of Republican voter ID laws that help less popular Republican candidates win elections by suppressing votes, I think, but I want to know what you think. Why is Fox News promoting these Republican voter ID laws that make it difficult, if not impossible, for millions of eligible voters to vote? And given that in-person voter impersonation fraud is virtually non-existent, aren't these Republican voter ID laws a solution in search of a problem?
I YouTube, you decide.